By the end of 1940, Adolf Hitler had personally overseen the conquest of Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Combined population of those countries on the order of 100 million people. Roughly 3/4 of the entire United States at the time. Combined duration of those campaigns, less than 14 months. His generals had advised caution on almost every one of them. They told him Poland would take longer than it did. They warned that a decisive armoured thrust through the Ardennes was a reckless gamble, while the French command largely agreed with them, treating the region as effectively impassable to tanks. Erich von Manstein's plan, the one that actually worked, was initially rejected by the general staff before Hitler intervened to push it forward. The German columns that actually moved through the Ardennes in May 1940 formed a traffic jam stretching 160 miles from the Meuse all the way back to the Rhine. A single Allied airstrike on the right day turns the war's most audacious gamble into a catastrophe. That's how close the inevitable French collapse actually was. In the 12 months where Germany performed the single greatest military achievement of the 20th century, the professional officer corps was consistently behind the curve. So when people tell you Hitler should have stepped back and let his generals run the war, it's worth asking exactly which war they think the generals would have run. After 1940, Hitler's interventions in operational command produced a documented series of disasters. The halt order at Dunkirk in May of that year helped make it possible for 338,000 Allied troops to escape across the Channel. Troops who would form the seasoned core around which a much larger British and Commonwealth army was rebuilt. The order originated with Gerd von Rundstedt and was confirmed by Hitler over the objections of Panzer commanders like Guderian. Many historians argue that without that pause, the Germans could have inflicted far heavier losses on the retreating force, and that Britain would have faced the rest of the war without the army it needed to keep fighting on land. Hitler's confirmation of that order, against the grain of his frontline commanders, shaped everything that followed. Barbarossa in 1941 produced the next argument. In August, with Army Group Center driving toward Moscow and the Soviet command structure visibly collapsing, Hitler redirected the advance south toward Ukraine. His generals, Heinz Guderian most vocally, argued that Moscow was the decisive objective, that its capture would sever Soviet rail logistics, and that the psychological blow of losing the capital might collapse Soviet resistance entirely. Hitler overruled them, sent the panzers south, captured Kiev and roughly 600,000 Soviet prisoners in the largest encirclement in military history, and then sent the exhausted, supply-depleted panzer groups, newly redesignated as panzer armies to reflect their growing operational weight, back north in October. The speed of the advance to that point had been almost incomprehensible. When the 4th Panzer Division rolled into the city of Orel on the 3rd of October, the advance had been so rapid that the city's trams were still running, packed with daily commuters who had no idea the front had just arrived at their doorstep. That momentum was gone by December. They ran out of steam within sight of Moscow's suburbs. The Soviet winter counteroffensive followed. Germany never threatened Moscow again. In 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad produced the argument that ends most debates. Senior German commanders from the pocket to Berlin, Friedrich Paulus trapped inside Stalingrad, Manstein at Army Group Don, Kurt Zeitzler as Army Chief of Staff in Berlin, all told Hitler the 6th Army needed to break out while it still could. He refused. 300,000 German soldiers were encircled and roughly 90,000 marched into Soviet captivity, of whom perhaps 5,000 ever returned home. Hitler had personally ordered the city held, personally promised relief that never came, and personally rejected the operational solution his generals unanimously recommended. That's the case, and those decisions, those consequences, are all in the historical record. But the case for the generals only holds up if you look at what they were actually asking to do. Not how they wanted to do it, but what. The German General Staff did not object to the war. They did not object to the invasion of the Soviet Union. Several of them had been planning eastward expansion since the 1920s. What they objected to was the timeline, the logistics, the specific operational choices. Their alternative was not, don't start a war of racial annihilation in the East. Their alternative was, start it more carefully and win it more efficiently. Erich von Manstein, the general most frequently cited as the man who could have won the war for Germany, never argued against Barbarossa. He argued about its execution. His memoirs, written after the war, are a masterclass in blaming Hitler for every failure while positioning the general staff as voices of sober reason. And they were enormously influential in shaping how Western audiences understood the war for decades. In the early Cold War, Western militaries were actively studying German operational doctrine and relying on German generals as sources and advisors. Those generals needed to be rehabilitable professionals, not architects of a war of annihilation. The British military historian John Keegan called the German general memoir tradition a massive act of collective self-exculpation. The generals who wrote those books needed to be the competent professionals undone by a madman, because the alternative was acknowledging they had willingly served one. The Wehrmacht's role in the occupied East was not a secret from the officer corps. The Commissar order, the directive to shoot captured Soviet political officers rather than take them prisoner, was issued through official military channels and implemented by field commanders, not the SS acting independently. Army group commanders signed off on logistical arrangements that deliberately starved Soviet prisoners of war, of whom roughly 3 million, out of an estimated 5.5 to over 6 million captured, died in German custody. That was not Hitler acting alone. That was the military institution. Some historians have argued that Wehrmacht generals running the war without the SS's racial ideology might have reduced Soviet will to fight, and that argument is identifying something real. What it underweights is that Wehrmacht generals and SS racial ideology were not separate forces that could be cleanly divided, so run the scenario forward anyway. Give them the war they wanted. See where it goes. Barbarossa proceeds on the Moscow First axis. Army Group Center drives harder and faster in the summer without the August diversion. The encirclement battles happen earlier. The German advance reaches Moscow's outskirts with better logistics and earlier timing. Does Moscow fall? Possibly. The Soviet government evacuated to Kuibyshev in October 1941 regardless. That happened in reality. Stalin stayed, which mattered, but the government's administrative machinery had already moved. A Moscow capture in September rather than a stalled advance in December changes the timeline significantly. Here's what happens next. The Soviet Union does not stop at Moscow. The industrial base had been moving east since 1940. By the end of 1941, Soviet authorities had relocated more than 1,500 major factories and roughly 16 million workers beyond the Urals. An entire industrial civilization dismantled and rebuilt on rails while the front rolled over its old foundations. Workers reassembling a massive steel works at Chelyabinsk were given 75 days to restart production. Working around the clock in frozen fields, they did it in 56. Chelyabinsk became the world's largest tank factory. Workers called it Tankergrad, Tank City. Soviet production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft was already exceeding Germany's by 1942, even in the disrupted reality of an invasion already underway. A more rational German operational sequence gets to the Volga faster. It does not get past it. The Caucasus oil fields, the fuel Germany needed to continue the war into 1943 and beyond, remain contested. A general-run war that avoids the Stalingrad catastrophe doesn't liberate German forces. It probably produces a longer, more stable Eastern Front that bleeds Germany more slowly at higher cost to the Soviets, while American industrial production scales up behind a British base that the Dunkirk decision already saved. The math that killed Germany was never Hitler's tactics. It was the disparity between what Germany could produce and what was being produced against it. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States together were manufacturing war material at a rate Germany could not match, regardless of who was running the operational map at the Wolf's Lair. A general-run war probably extends the conflict. It does not change the direction. The question nobody asks is what that Nazi state does with the extra time. If you want history that goes past the operational maps and into the decisions that actually shaped the modern world, this is the channel for you. Now back to the question. A more competent German war effort, Caucasus secured, Stalingrad avoided, defensive lines held, means a regime that hasn't been militarily broken. The clandestine phases of the T4 euthanasia program, the camps in occupied Poland, the systematic murder of Soviet civilians and prisoners, all of that continues and accelerates. By 1942, the killing infrastructure was already competing with the military for rail capacity, manpower, and administrative reach. A regime not being driven back has no such competition. The camps get the trains. In the real war, Germany's operational incompetence contributed to the speed of its final collapse. The 1944 catastrophe in France, the encirclements in the east, the accelerating disintegration of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration. All of that ended the war faster than a more disciplined military machine might have. The war Germany actually fought was terrible. A general-run Germany might have fought a longer one, but that framing never extends to the other side of the ledger. More blood spilled on the battlefield also means the machinery of mass murder running longer in occupied Europe. It contains a hidden assumption that a more competent Nazi leadership pursuing the same ideological goals through more rational military means would have produced a better outcome. Better for whom, exactly, is the question the framing avoids. The men who wanted operational control were already running the occupation simultaneously in the same command zones. Walter von Reichenau, commanding the 6th Army before Paulus, issued his own severity order calling for the execution of civilians and prisoners, going further than Hitler had even asked. Walter Model, celebrated by military historians as one of the war's great defensive geniuses, stabilized the Rjev salient by ordering the poisoning of local wells, the deportation of 15,000 Russian men for forced labor, and the complete leveling of over 100 villages in a scorched earth withdrawal. Gerd von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South during the SS operations in Ukraine, providing direct logistical support for the death squads operating in the region, including the events at Babi Yar. That's who was going to run this war. Manstein understood the operational problem. He never acknowledged what solving it would have preserved. The war these men would have run might have been longer, and the state running it would have had more time, more capacity, and less external pressure to direct toward the occupied territories. The industrial gap still closes against Germany. The Allied coalition still wins. What changes is the duration, and what that duration means for everyone living under Nazi administration while the front holds. What it does produce is a more durable Nazi state. The killing machinery doesn't slow down when the military gets more competent. The Hitler ruined everything argument is really a claim that he ruined Germany's war. Whether that's true matters far less than what the framing leaves out. The war being run better by the people who designed and implemented the Commissar Order, the prisoner starvation policy, and the occupied territory administration would have been a better outcome for anyone other than Germany, is a different question entirely. So, here's where it splits. One position. Hitler's personal interventions were the decisive variable. Remove them, and Germany either wins a limited war or at minimum negotiates a tolerable peace before the full Allied industrial weight lands. The Dunkirk decision alone changed the entire trajectory. The other position, the structural weight of American and Soviet production, made the outcome inevitable from the moment Germany failed to knock Britain out in 1940. And a more competent German war effort just means more dead people on the way to the same ending. Both are defensible. Drop it in the comments. Subscribe if you're not already here. And thanks for watching.